Hello, I'm Jan Richard-Dahms, the Vice President of U.S. Development with Join Mayshad. We are an ecosystem of brands for women by women, connecting women to each other and to the companies, causes, and organizations that champion equity for women professionally and personally. Today, you're watching our Diversity, Equity, Inclusion show brought to you each and every week. Please make sure to join our YouTube channel to view all of our content, including our Women in Money show. And each and every week, we kick off the week with Dr. Risa Reiger, our investor and clinical psychologist. I'm thrilled and honored to welcome Michael Chamberlain with us today. Hi, Michael. Welcome.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for being with us today. This is going to be an incredible conversation. I'm a big fan of Catalyst, so can't wait to dive in.
Thank you.
Michael is the global markets and diversity, inclusion, and belonging expert. He's convening and community programs, strategic partnerships head at Catalyst. Michael, before the show, we were talking about our new world of pivoting and how things are changing in such an extreme fashion from week to week, month to month during this very historic moment in time in the United States. Talk to us about what's changed at Catalyst. What are you seeing that's come out, and what are some of your aha moments?
Sure. I mean, the pivot word is an interesting word because it gives me a particularly strong reaction, in some ways very positive, in some ways I'm wondering and increasingly curious if it's enough. But, to answer your question, we decided to cancel our biggest annual event, an event that's been going on for decades at Catalyst and one of our signature fundraisers. So we made a really difficult and challenging decision to cancel that event in early March, right before here in Manhattan, it became, there became rules around who could and could not convene and what those numbers look like. So we had made a proactive decision, canceled right before those regulations took place, which I said, was very difficult. But since then, we have been very committed to pivoting, making sure that our supporters and our community members are getting what we believe is the most important and most critical information that they need to continue to just participate as fully as they can as employees, let alone progress. And so, I would say, to answer your question about what has changed, I think the content has changed drastically. So we've long talked about flexibility, but being able to empower people to not only fully understand, but embrace remote working, virtual working, what that means for individuals, what that means for teams, what that means for those who have the capability and those that maybe don't or are challenged to access it. But also what opportunities exist in that disruption for things like inclusion, which is our area of expertise, and really laser focused on what that means in particular for women, making sure that we don't lose the gains we've worked so hard for years, for women in particular in the workplace. We don't want to lose those gains. So what does it all mean? It means looking very hard at the facts, talking to people, listening to our communities, and I think continuing to push people to think inclusively, which I know we'll dive into more deeply. But I would say that pivot focus, just leaning into technology, getting familiar with it, trying, I think doing a lot of failing fast and learning and moving on. So the technology piece is on one side of this. And then the other side is just looking very concisely at where we are uniquely positioned to help people in a time when they need it in lots of areas. And I think for Catalyst, it's those areas that I spoke about a moment ago.
It's interesting. Catalyst launched in the 60s, and that was a very specific, unique moment in time in our history as well. And when you think about the ways in which women have progressed and how we think about inclusion and belonging and diversity has progressed in the last 40 years, so much has changed, and yet so much hasn't, right? And just listening to what you're saying now in the sense of kind of the urgency around how we think about these things differently to ensure that we don't lose some of the ground that we made in the past, right? And I hear this a lot in many of our conversations with women in our ecosystem as well, is that that's one of the fears, is that as we continue the balance between remote work and going back to the office, and really finding the balance between how does one manage everything that one's now responsible for within the home, in ensuring that also we're on track with keeping the gains that we realized in the sense of, everything from pay equality to promotional opportunities to just how you're valued and respected and how you show up as a leader. Talk to us a bit about how Catalyst is on the forefront of ensuring that we don't take 5 steps back as we're trying to make 2 steps forward.
Sure. So thank you for, Catalyst, a little bit about us. We were founded in 1962 by Felice Schwartz here in New York City, where I am today. And the premise of the organization which she built was kind of her awareness of the world and her awareness of the world, from her unique perspective about women's role in it. And she saw and was herself an educated woman who had a child and found it very difficult to find work, either part-time or even full-time, because there are all these assumptions about what women with children, let alone women, could and could not do, this perception of that. And having children certainly layered on this notion that there was less value with that potential employee. And so she fought hard to help those types of women, those educated, interested, determined women, and in many cases, those new moms, present themselves to potential employees as valuable. And so, we look back at that now and admire that work, and also understand that it was in many cases kind of this quote unquote fix the women, make them show up in ways that were valued by organizations and leaders in the organizations, largely and historically those white men. And so the evolution of Catalyst has really been about changing the way in which we work, which is not about fixing the women. It's about fixing the organizations and breaking and redefining these systemic barriers and these stereotypes, redefining what it means to lead. Genderless in many ways, but also showing up with your gender and being valued just as you are. And so, over that almost 60 years, we've transformed to looking at programs, policies, and most importantly, organizational cultures to do a real redefining of that work. In the last few years, we've had the Me Too movement and now the COVID-19 pandemic, which has really just put a heavy, heavy spotlight and transparency really on these systemic issues, these biases that have long existed. And what we are really focused on trying to do is work collaboratively and in partnership with all kinds of leaders, but certainly those white men who still retain the most of the positions of influence around the world, to help them understand that these biases serve no one, and that they're limiting for the purpose of what, really. And my perception of what that means content-wise and strategy-wise for Catalyst in light of this latest phase of disruption is what I call kind of admiring the problem. For example, we're watching people make really tough decisions about what going back to school looks like, or which of the individuals within the home should be the breadwinner while the other one, falls into the role of homekeeping, childcare, elder care, et cetera, those other responsibilities. And thus far, the answer has been, at least what I have seen collectively from the biggest perspective, the answer has been to kind of accept the regretted loss that will undoubtedly be women. And so that to me is the fallback. And where is the true redefinition there? Where is the innovation that should spring from disruption? Not to fall back, but to make decisions where that is, all the considerations are made. Who can present the most value? Who can do the best work? Who can be the most flexible, et cetera? And so we are urging people to consider all of their options, not just the one that historically was the most convenient, and we're not and to be very vigilant with sharing our point of view that this work, diversity, inclusion, equity, et cetera, when it relates to women, the monolith, right? When it relates to women, it's not about making room for women. It's about understanding that that is a loss of talent and a loss of innovation. That's a loss to the business. It's a loss to individuals to have that limited a concept. That this isn't about making room. It's about really breaking down systems that weren't all that great for people historically, and rebuilding a new opportunity for everybody. So we're really focused on presenting that business case, which seems to be a constant requirement in the business world. Why does diversity and inclusion matter financially, as a return on investment, et cetera? And also this new layer, I hope, of what we've seen in the world of kind of redefining what used to be considered those soft skills. Where is empathy? Where is compassion? Where is the corporate responsibility perspective. And we know that women add so much value in that space. And suddenly those soft skills are now the really hard skills. And, we need the full participation of everyone, not to fall back on those old tribes and old tropes about what leadership looked like, et cetera. So we're very determined on making sure that content is available as broadly as possible, and then working very constructively, and as I said, in partnership with our supporters and other invested parties to make sure that we are dismantling these old tropes and rebuilding a kind of new concept.
That was beautiful. Beautiful on so many points. I want to follow up on what you just said, Michael. Thank you for this. So, it's interesting. I love what you said around the unique perspectives around your own personal experience as a basis point for why Catalyst was founded in the 60s. And when we think about like what was happening during that moment in time, the 60s, the 70s, the second wave feminist movement, the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and so much of the protests that happened, just questioning why the United States was there. And, when we think about, those moments and times, sure, we've evolved and hindsight is what it is. It's so funny. One of my friends the other day was saying to me, hindsight's 2020. And then he said, I wonder if the person who actually came up with that phrase knew what was going to happen in 2020.
Probably not, but yeah.
Probably not. But anyway, so I want to talk about the intersectionality of what we see happening today versus what was happening in the 60s and 70s, because even though there was much crossover and a bit of integration across those movements that I just mentioned, for a large part, the critique of second wave feminism, for example, is that it really was for middle class white women who were coming of age, I guess you could say, in the sense of discovering themselves and discovering their careers and wanting to become more independent. And that movement was often critiqued for leaving others out.
Right.
And now we're at a very different moment in time where you're absolutely right. We have, the Me Too movement, we have Take a Knee, we have Black Lives Matter, we have, so much economic disruption in the US because of COVID. But, you're right, like many of these things weren't working to begin with. And then COVID just got us to the inception point. Right. And so from your perspective, let's talk about race and inclusion and equity and how you think Catalyst will be a part of that discussion going forward to make sure that we're not forgetting about race and ethnicity as we think about how women are empowered in the workplace.
Yeah, I mean, that's extraordinarily important. And that has been a part of the Catalyst evolution over the past 60 years as well. And, kind of one of the lesser known aspects of our brand's evolution is it was 15 years ago, if not more, when a researcher that worked with us, Catherine Giscombe, started research work. I should say that the basis of everything Catalyst does is on research. And so we try to be extraordinarily factual. And, feelings are not facts, although they're extraordinarily important, but we'll save that for a follow-up. So Catherine Giscombe understood that women were not a monolith. And, what works for white women doesn't necessarily work for other women. And pressed really hard with even our board to ensure that we had a body of research that looked specifically at the experiences of women of color in the workplace, to understand the unique barriers that they were facing or the extraordinarily more complex barriers that they were facing versus, and versus other women. To truly understand that and make sure that we understood as an organization, and then therefore the partners that we work with understood that policies and programs were terrific, but they too could not be, successful as monoliths. They really had to understand the unique circumstances at play. And I think that, this level of awareness in the United States in particular that's happened over the last few months is incredibly opportunistic, as negative and challenging and dark as it feels for many of us on that day-to-day basis. But that awareness could be an advantage, or something, as I said a moment ago, an opportunity ignored or simply admired and left behind. And the good news that I feel is that, from all of the areas in our organization, at least that I participate in, is that individuals within these communities that we serve are asking very specifically about information, tools, programs, examples, samples, etc., about the experiences of other non-majority groups. And the intersectionality place, I'm really so glad that you asked that question, is so Catherine, just to let me step back for a moment. So Catherine started this work a decade plus ago. Some of the latest evolution of that work was about intersectionality, psychological safety, and emotional tax. And we had partnered with Essence Magazine a few years back to launch our first emotional tax report. And that emotional tax very specifically was about understanding, defining, and sharing the unique experiences of people of color in the workplace and the extraordinary burden that many of them face each and every day, from being kind of that outsider group and trying to assimilate and show up as what an insider looks like culturally at that organization, what that costs every day, because you're constantly thinking about it. So from a business perspective, you're actually not thinking about your job as much as you could, but just the daily psychological burden that weight upon people of color specifically is. We have to understand that. We have to name it for what it is and talk about it. And then, just the burden of people feeling, and we heard this in our research explicitly, feeling on guard, quote unquote, each and every day, waiting for the shoe to drop, waiting for some microaggression or overt aggression to really attack them and set them back in the workplace, and to imagine what that is like, to be aware of that all the time and what that feeling is like as a white person, a man in this particular case, completely ignorant of that fact. So that awareness, at least for me, a person compelled to at least address fairness in the workplace, which we know men care about a lot. So I'll talk about that later. But for me, it's hard to look at that fact and not be at least curious about it, let alone try to do something to change that. Not fix it, because that's what we tend to do as humans. We try to dive in and fix things without thoughtfully understanding them or even communicating with those that we think we're helping. And so you can see at catalyst.org, for your viewers, I hope you'll go and visit, a lot of information about race, anti-racism, emotional tax, psychological safety, so that we can together build a foundation of awareness and then just see tactically what each of us can try, what each of us can do, how to bridge barriers through conversations, more inclusive behaviors that we can practice to get there a little bit further. And, I think what's happening in the world, and I'll just look at the political lens, for example, what we saw with the announcement of Kamala Harris, this is a first. Having a woman like her, a woman of color like her, nominated to that position is a first. And firsts are absolutely critical, but they're insufficient. We need seconds, and we need, I hope, inevitably movements of this where that is not a one and done, but that is a new normal. And that's an extraordinary amount of pressure for Kamala Harris to be carrying, by the way. But I think what it does at such a high visibility place is offer us the opportunity, in each of our lives to talk about that with our loved ones, with our families, with our coworkers. Like, what does that mean? And why is that so unique? And some people are just going with the flow because that's what they were hoping for. And other people are really challenging that. And all those perspectives, valid. The opportunity we have is to talk about those and be informed about the experience of somebody who's not like us. Really understand our privilege as white people, and break, et cetera, et cetera. We could talk about that probably for hours, but I think what's important to share, at least from the Catalyst lens, and answer the question you asked me, is we've understood that women are not a monolith for a very long time. And we've worked extraordinarily hard to dedicate time, resources, and those partnerships with our supporters to work specifically in that area to inform all the other work that we do as well. So it's not also set off to the side. It's part of everything, but it's also being specifically worked on, which I think is incredibly important as well. It can't just become, all lives matter sort of thing. We have to pay particular attention, important, invested in intentional intention to that space and those experiences so that we can go back and make sure the work that we're doing really matters, resonates, and is applicable to as many people as possible. For that's, to us what inclusion really means. I hope that helps answers your question.
That was an incredible answer. And again, so many things I want to follow up on in relationship to what you just said. And they're also interrelated, but yet also seemingly could be perceived to be disconnected in a way. Let's talk about white privilege, for example.
Sure.
So, that's definitely come up in this moment in time. We see it with, the ways in which, access to things like healthcare, which many of us take for granted, has really impacted who gets sick, who's on a ventilator, who dies, right? Who has underlying health conditions. And, my fear is that what we're seeing in this moment in time is that there's a school of thought that says, well, those with underlying conditions brought it on themselves, right? Without really understanding the way in which racism is institutionalized into our society and has been for, hundreds of years.
Right.
And, the perspective of even, New York City is becoming such a dangerous place to live because that's what some people see in the news, right? And so, and the protesters weren't protesters, they were all rioters, right? And so anytime that in the last few months where there have been these aha moments that for all of us, we should be thinking, wow, like maybe I should think about this differently. For some people, the assumption is to go to the bad place. Right. And so many of us have these types of conversations like what you and I are having today, but they could also be seen as preaching to the choir, right? Because you and I are kind of on the same side on these subjects, right?
Yeah.
And so how do we expand beyond kind of the audiences and the communities and our networks and our ecosystems with which we usually find ourselves in, particularly in a really important moment? This is an election year. And this is probably for many of us the most important election year of our lives.
Right.
So how do we start to think about bridging some of those divides where people are so still inside their box in the sense of how they think about the other? Because this is really about fear. It's about the fear of giving up power. It's about the fear of giving up privilege. It's about the fact that soon we're not going to be, we have, and I can't remember, Michael, like you'll probably know this better than the year by which, Caucasians will be a minority in this country, right? Because so we see so much progress in so many ways, but yet in this moment in time, many of us feel like there's still so much misinformation and lack of awareness as to what's really happening. So how do we tap into some of those audiences where that message really needs to be heard? I guess is my question.
Yeah, well, I mean, I hope that I can help answer it to some degree of intelligence and helpfulness, right? Acknowledging that my understanding of all of this is extraordinarily incomplete. While I've been doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work for 15 years, which I think helps. It's also, the more you know, the more you know, the more you need to know, kind of thing. And so I'll say that, number one, and I'd say, I don't want this to be daunting to your followers, but being committed to inclusion is a lifetime commitment. You don't get it and then are done with it, and suddenly you are, certified and credentialed and not a part of the problem anymore. I mean, it's a constant commitment and learning. You wake up every day and decide that, diversity is a fact. Inclusion is a choice, but it's a choice that you have to make every day. There's always something to learn and a new experience to share and intake, et cetera. So I put that on one side. And another side, kind of to call you in. I mean, you used the word Caucasian a moment ago. And I think that is an antiquated phrase, right? Because that's people from the Caucasus region and not necessarily white. What that means, but it's been kind of brought into the vernacular and unquestioned in the United States for decades. It still shows up on some forms that we are asked to complete, et cetera. And so we have to evolve. Our understanding for what things are not necessarily facts. They're just things we've taken as facts for a long time and without deep consideration or curiosity put upon that. It's just like, that's the way it is. And so, so that's one observation I would make. And with an imperfect, again, point to it, I think what we're seeing is some fragility and some idea that we are still, as I kind of said earlier on, we as the white majority still are being asked to make room for other people. And we are still being asked to give up something to present an advantage to somebody else. It's this zero-sum game that's in our mind. And it's expressed overtly and subtly in lots of things, from the marketing that we see every day that's imposed upon us, the way we speak, to some of the ways that our leadership speaks, transparently and about what that means. And it's hard to ignore that stuff as fact. But the great news, I think, and the optimistic lens that I would put on this is that people are now aware. There's a general awareness about this fact and an inquisition that's happening that at least I haven't seen in my time on Earth, where people really being like, this isn't right. And what we're seeing with Black Lives Matter, what we're seeing with the people taking the streets and the rallies and the protests is a longer duration than I've ever seen, when things like this have happened in periods of time prior. There's a sustainability to this now, a real movement that change must come and people are demanding it. And it's great to see allies of people of color out there also demanding it, and understanding that there is a fairness and equitable distribution of things that isn't quite right. And so that to me is the lens of optimism that I like to use, is that curiosity. And we can use that, people that are committed to doing this work and also people who just want to make a difference in the world. You don't have to be a practitioner with a, professional shingle hanging on your door to do this. And that's where I get extraordinarily excited, is that, everyday people are curious. They're curious about what they can do to make a difference, what kind of conversations they can have that really is about their own flawed thinking and what they believed all along, what they were taught to believe all along, and really just kind of questioning what's right about that, what's wrong about that, what could I do differently, what path can I be on differently to be a better ally to those that I now know because I'm seeing, witnessing, experiencing, or I'm told, and I should pay at least some attention to that storyline, that there is a purposeful inequity that's been going on for far too long. And I think, so for us at Catalyst, we can do research and we can share experiences, and storytelling is so incredibly important. It makes the most difference, probably more than any research report could do, to look somebody else in the eye or hear their voice explain what their experience has been. We need more of that. And as I would say, as a white person with privilege, and I would also say that most people with privilege and in a historically majority position, whether at work or in life or both, they don't know they have it. And all the conditions of the world are not there to inform you that you have privilege. It's just there and taken for granted. And until that's questioned or you lose it, you don't really know. And so here we are operating, believing that we're doing good, or maybe not, but mostly believing that we're doing good without any idea that the systems that we participate in were largely designed by us. So again, not aware of the biases, ignoring them further, and that kind of compounds the problem, right? All the systems, our workplace infrastructures, healthcare access that you were describing a moment ago, who has that, who has not, mostly built by white people. And so because from the foundation, they were never built inclusively, how could they possibly represent everyone? And that's, the more we're aware of that, and the more we can participate in redefining that, whether that's in a rally or the way we vote, or choosing to be what I like to call an upstander at work, like calling things out, saying things aren't right and they shouldn't happen moving forward. All of us have some influence, however small or big we believe our spheres to be. And the great part about this moment is that everybody's watching. So whether you believe that you yourself are making a difference, somebody's watching you and taking that as what role modeling is, what's expected, what kind of behavior we will tolerate or that we should aspire to be. Somebody's watching all of us. And so the great part is put that in your mind, and not like a paranoid kind of way, but put that in your mind. It keeps you on a path to better behavior, number one. And it kind of helps set the tone with those that you keep close company with, or those that you're on teams with in the workplace. And, moving forward, we should be using our curiosity. We should be speaking up. We should be acknowledging when certain people are speaking all the time and other people aren't, and making room for others. I like to call that, as I said, the better upstander, because it's not a bystander. It's not somebody who just sits back and lets the world just be. So again, I've gone off on a kind of multiple paths there, which we could go to, but I can't help myself.
So, I think it's interesting because I think sometimes people that want to create positive change in the world think about it from a very lofty, strategic, changing the world perspective. But I really appreciate what you said around those everyday things that people with privilege can do. And really, identity is complex. And we talk about this a lot at Mayshad, where you're not just white or not. You're not just male or female. You're not just one thing or another, but you're the intersectionality of all your differences and beautiful differences. And, we really, because Mayshad as an ecosystem is so diverse in the sense of really embracing voices from different generations and different professional and personal backgrounds, and really value, Michael, what you said around the storytelling component of it, because it's, I think particularly in this moment in time, look, like there's so many really hard things that we're going through at very different moments and times too, depending upon where you are in the country. But then also as we realize that, out of what is it, 55, 56, 57 million Americans that have filed unemployment claims, women are overrepresented in each of those categories as well. So it hasn't been easy. But yet many of us are using this moment in time to step back and say, who do we really want to be when we grow up, right? Like, what is the value we really want to create now, knowing that we're not going back to what was in the past? And how can I be a better global citizen in this moment in time? And I think the complexity of that, like what I said, is that we tend to think very lofty, like, how can I save the world? How can I create change? Without understanding that you can actually create change by your everyday actions each and every single day, right? Because how many times have we been a part of a conversation in a company around the water cooler or out for drinks or out for dinner with clients for something that you may not agree with and that is wrong has been said, but you chose not to say anything for whatever reason, right? And using this as a moment in time to really, I love what you said around upstanding, taking this moment in time to call it out. And it's interesting because I think that, so many of us in this time period have wanted to include more voices of diversity on our radio shows, on our podcasts, in our workshops, in our seminars, like whatever we're producing, right? And like we see this a lot in, the women's empowerment space. And I can imagine that for many women of color and men of color, that causes an incredible emotional strain because now they're kind of asked to fix the problem for us, right? And so those ways in which those moments and times happen where, white people may not understand what they're doing by thinking that they're doing the right thing, but then there's a way in which we need to fix the problem ourselves, right? Can we talk a little bit more about that in the sense of, the role that people that have privilege, no matter how you define privilege, going to be defined in many ways, can actually do more, whether it's upstanding or other things that you see happening with the companies that you work with that are working?
Yeah, I mean, I hope I can in a way that's helpful. I think one of the things we've learned over the decades of doing this kind of work is that, programs and policies are essential. You need those because they are guideposts to expectations for everybody. And that's the great thing about the workplace, right? As flawed, as imperfect as it is, it has structure. You can't just do anything that you want, And so within structure, you can have some flexibility, but there are rules. And those rules too have evolved. And so that's, using workplace specifically, I think what each of us can do there is, so understanding that is embracing, being aware of, understanding the programs and policies, understanding that things like work-life flexibility programs and employee resource groups, affinity groups, things like that, they're not women's programs, right? So men specifically who benefit from work-life programs, as an example, can do more by talking to others, particularly talking to other men about why those programs benefit them, so that we can begin to disassociate those as women's programs and value them for what they are truly intended to be, like programs that are for everyone. So I think there's a little bit of that men can do, right? They can talk more about utilizing those kinds of things. They can talk more about the value that they have, and men can do a lot better about being curious with other men, talking to other men, and being more open and engaging about this particular conversation we're having with other men. It's great that they're doing that with women, for sure. But to your point, like, we can't consistently go to the non-majority asking them to fix the majority problem. And so we can lean in and be curious and learn, but we can't say, please fix this for us and I'll just do whatever you tell me to do. I'm here to help, but you got to be a little bit more of a participant than that. No performative allyship anymore, which is, allyship in name, but no real behavior backing it up. We have to, no armchair allies. We have to get out there and do the work. So I think for men, there's a lot of that talking to one another and just being open and transparent in a way that kind of markets and promotes the value of programs that have historically been labeled as women's programs, right? And so I think that's one very specific thing that we can do. The other thing is, as I was mentioning, the programs and policies that are absolutely essential, they're insufficient if the culture isn't there. If there isn't a culture of inclusion and it's a culture of white supremacy, no program or policy is going to do much good or any good at all. It certainly won't do it in a sustainable way. So the culture really needs to be one that embraces inclusion and understands exactly what inclusion is, not the idea of it. But so that's where Catalyst, and there's other groups doing work like this, but that's where Catalyst in particular can help, because all of what we know about inclusion is based on facts and based on research from studying organizations. So we're talking about the workplace, if you're asking, and understanding what inclusion means to us is kind of a simple equation. Inclusion equals uniqueness plus belonging. And that's where people can show up as who they are. And, when you were noting these complexities of intersectionality, it's who they choose to show too. As an LGBTQ plus community member myself, for a long time, I covered that I was a gay man, but I showed up as a white man, or I showed up as a white Catholic, or I showed up as a white person from Canada now in the US, an immigrant of sorts. And that way, I choose which layers of myself to show up with. But the condition of inclusion allows me the flexibility of showing up how I'd like, in a productive, positive way, but showing up and saying, this is who I am. The belongingness part is not just you can be whoever you want to be, but it's we find value in difference as an organization. We see and seek out value in difference. So different isn't a bad commodity, it's a valuable commodity. So when those two conditions are present in a workplace, we have what we call that culture of inclusion. If then you have programs and policies that the organization understands, they're clear about, people talk about using them, then suddenly you get more and more inclusion. You get all the benefits of inclusion, like innovation, which we all desperately need right now. We've seen these profound increases in perceptions on team citizenship. Like people have your back. We're willing to step in for one another. All of those could not be more necessary in this moment. And there's one other piece I'd love to say about intersectionality in light of COVID, in particular, and the pandemic in particular, as more and more and more of us who have the capacity to work from home, suddenly that stuff that we used to leave at the door is part of everything. Unless we blur out our backgrounds or even know how to do that, we're showing up with our homes, with our art choices, with our families, with our children. We're in apartments, we're in homes, we're in the country. All of these conditions that we each as individuals have perceptions about are suddenly this new layers of things that we have to figure out about people and our teams. And we have to really think, what assumptions am I making here? That, this person lives with their parents, or this person has elder care responsibilities, or 5 children or no children. All of these things suddenly are part of our everyday experience. And we have a real opportunity here to embrace all of that and be flexible with one another, to give one another air coverage and understand flexibility as a business benefit and a life benefit. And the intersectionality piece is the part that I feel like, we spent some time talking about monoliths, is now a critical area of discussion. Some days I show up with no problems and I have no distractions and no responsibilities, and I can be that Michael that you knew before this pandemic. But other days I might show up with other considerations and responsibilities, and I have to be a little bit more flexible than I used to be. That is not about my ability as a professional. That's my life. And those are the conditions in which we now operate. And you have those, and all of our colleagues have those. And so some of the work that we've been doing in the last several months are really understanding how people are handling that. How are people handling this new barrage of information about one another, and what are the best ways to handle it? Hopefully inclusively. And so we're giving people tools to understand what's happening and tools to, we hope, have conversations with one another that are more proactive and more inclusive. So we call them leading in behaviors and leading out behaviors. It's things like, how are we curious with one another, but also how do we task ourselves? How do we self-reflect? How do we challenge what we brought to the table, our own assumptions, our own beliefs, our conceptions or misconceptions? And so it's this new kind of dichotomy about how one participates and shows up with other people, but also what are you doing working on the individual, and how do you show up that way? Because that's more critically important now than I think ever before. So the good news is that we don't have to just figure it out on our own, right? We have some great research. We have the curiosity of a community, I think, for a large part, willing to explore things with each other in new ways that's different than before and less scary than before. And that to me is extraordinarily exciting. And that's where, from all of this disruption, innovation will come. The last piece I'll make on that, if I may, is, we see people struggling with what to do with back to school. And the schools don't necessarily have the answer, and the businesses don't necessarily have the answer. If we have conversations of inclusion available to us with one another, people will find innovative ways to solve these dynamically difficult problems, and we'll be able to share them on social media and other ways where we can amplify the existence of an actual solution, and we'll build stuff together in ways that we never have before. Because we're not stuck in our silos, we're not stuck in our tribes or our homogeneous collectives. I hope, if we go the right way with all of this, that we will suddenly have this wellspring of ideas being shared with one another, solutions being built together. That's the pathway to innovation, which has for a very long time been very difficult to build. We know the path to failure when we see it, right? Because we've experienced and be like, well, that didn't work. But innovation's a harder line to draw. And I think now what we can do is draw that line. And that's, what does behavior look like now? What can we build differently now? And that, I think, is, the theory of disruption, which practitioners have long used, but it's disruption that's never happened on this massive a scale before. And so maybe there's a reset button and it's been hit. And, we have a chance here or an opportunity to do things dynamically differently with what we know. We don't have to admire the possibility.
Michael, it's interesting because I can't help but think that, from a disruption perspective, the entire discipline of HR is going to go through seismic shifts, just in the sense of it's no longer acceptable to hire and recruit and mentor and promote based upon hard skills, which we know that that's never really truly been the case, but soft skills have always been much harder to measure, right? You can display behaviors that embody what those soft skills are, but it's not necessarily as cut and dry as, can you get this task done, yes or no, right? And as you talk about, things like empathy and understanding and flexibility and how you're showing up as a leader and how you're leading, for the leader, her or himself, but then also all of the team members, that's a very different way by which we'll be communicating with each other, right? To ensure that we're able to provide employees of all genders a safe and trusting and transparent work environment. So I'm wondering, ways in which, how will companies and leaders really think about the metrics by which success is then measured, right? So how are you ensuring that you're really displaying empathy, and who defines what empathy is or isn't? Who decides and defines what what flexibility is and isn't. And then how do you measure that and wrap that up into your annual performance appraisal processes with a nice bow, right? And to ensure then, everything that then triggers from that in the sense of, bonuses and promotions and et cetera, salary increases then really follow suit. And so I would envision that means HR really having to take a hard look at itself to really think about, like, as a function, how will it play a more critical role in the overall success of a company? When in the past, HR has been often perceived, not always, and there are some incredible HR teams headed by brilliant people, but often it's perceived to be kind of as one of those, support mechanisms, support systems as a part, instead of being really fully integrated into the business strategy.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's an extraordinarily good question, and I think in many cases a hard one and a challenging one, but so there's some good news here. One of the pieces of good news that I really embrace is, Catalyst did work years ago now about gendered leadership. Men take charge, women take care. And it put all of those, what we used to call soft skills, in this category of feminine, women. Those are the skills that women have. And we've seen how those biases have manifested over the years, that women have this kind of Goldilocks scenario that they are faced with every day too, that they're either too soft or they're too hard, and there's no just right. And men have to show up with this valiant, armor of steel, and showing any kind of consideration toward the compassionate, empathetic side is a ding in that armor. And to you made a point about not interrupting something and going home and thinking about what you could or could not have done. We know from the work that we do specific to men that's an emotional tax, to go home and think about what I could and could not have done in the conditions that the workplace has prescribed as to why men have to carry that now intellectually or cover that. All of that is now open up to us. Where HR, I think, also has an opportunity is before they were, as you said, kind of in that agnostic, regulated space, and they were there to do very specific things. And now that corporate social responsibility and people metrics and cultural metrics, like cultures of inclusion metrics, have become absolutely mandatory from future employees, present employees, and just the kind of world conversation in general. There's this kind of confluence of those who used to have the diversity, equity, and inclusion responsibilities, whether professionally or kind of as a side gig, somebody who led the employee resource group, et cetera, had the proclivities and tendencies, those kind of behaviors that allowed them to succeed in those spaces. That was kind of set over as this nice to have role, and in some cases, very formal roles. Now that those worlds are kind of mixing together. And that's where, again, if we're sharing inclusively, we can inform our policies to be better at deciding what the right metrics are to measure courage, humility, accountability, empathy, et cetera, all of those historically labeled soft skills, and put them in a space where we can define what those are in annual criteria and hold people accountable for them, which is critically important. Accountability is the one piece in the business world that's been missing for decades. We talk about it. It's, again, another thing that we admire. We often reward people for doing these kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion things, but we don't penalize people for not doing them. So the diversity piece has always been the carrot, but there's never been a stick. And I think that's going to change. Just culturally, I don't think people can get away with it anymore, but with not having a concern about those skills, let alone actual skills in those areas. So I think there will be a merging. We'll see more HR teams merging with diversity, equity, and inclusion professionals in their discussions and the program planning, more holistic approaches on what culture means, not just what programs and policies do we have, this laundry list that covers everybody. Because as I said earlier, those will only work so well if the culture doesn't lift them up. And so that merging of roles and responsibilities into what everybody is responsible for and what everybody is accountable for, that is the trend we want to see, where it isn't just sitting over there as a system in a checkbox, but this is an expectation of how you show up. It's the new redefinition, right? It's not that men are going to show up taking charge and women are going to show up taking care. It's everybody is going to show up as an inclusive leader, here's what that looks like as concretely and organically, I think, as we can describe it. And here's what we're going to do in your annual review process to make sure that we're holding one another accountable for all of these things. And here's what we expect you as individuals to do among your day-to-day interactions, your teams, your business partners, your clients and suppliers. It has far-reaching implications if we follow through.
I want to talk a bit about going back to something you mentioned earlier around first, and the perception often that when we've hit the first female a CEO or X number of women on a board or X percentage of female entrepreneurs that get funding, and so many times I think that we have a tendency to be kind of razzled and dazzled by the shiny penny, right? And so that often is the first female to do something, and within the company context. Let's talk a bit, Michael, also about the importance of ensuring that that we're also lifting women up from the moment in time that they walk into their first job when they graduate from college, or even before that even, right? And how it's important not to get so trapped up into the mindset of the first, but to ensure, to the point that you made earlier on, that we have more and more and more and more, and that those privileges and honors just aren't reserved for women at the top.
Yeah, it's an extraordinarily great question. I think, from infancy to adulthood, all of these things are baked into us. What our family teaches us, what our friends and networks teach us, what we teach them. And that's all based on conceptions, preconceived notions, culture, religion. There's lots of things that inform what we think individuals and groups can or cannot do. And so that's going to take a lot of time. And I refer to it as this lifetime commitment. I don't know that I will see this great, sweeping, equitable world in my lifetime, but I hope that we were setting up the right conditions for generations to come. A little bit more on the pessimistic side, if I may, is, I do know from years and years of work that a lot of people are intellectually relying on the next generation to come in and just change everything. And that, Gen Y, millennials, etc., they don't think these things. They live in an equitable mindset. And once they come and hold the majority of the positions, this will all change. And so we, Catalyst, being inquisitive folks that we are, we studied that. And we looked at thousands of MBA programs across the world to understand what the experience of that graduate into first job looked like. Because if indeed we were entering this more equitable phase of reality, then maybe that kind of give it time theory would in fact prove true. And the answer is no. And I forget the exact number, 2,000, 3,000 or so individuals that we looked at as a longitudinal study over a period of time. And in first job, taking men and women and comparing them, in first job, women were on average getting paid $4,600 less for the exact same job as their male counterparts. And over a period of time, they were receiving fewer promotions and lesser pay increases per promotion than their male counterparts. And so right from the gate, with even this next generation, there's inequity. And it starts in pay and in roles of influence. And so you can imagine that over the years, that just accumulates and accumulates and accumulates. And then suddenly women, have a lifetime of work and they're hundreds of thousands of dollars behind. And so, no, this isn't a life of equity that's just going to happen when those folks show up. More so, they'll show up, they'll hate the conditions in which they are working in. And what we're seeing with that generation is they're more apt to leave. Their tendency to move. And so the regretted loss for businesses has to be taken extraordinarily seriously. The cost of recruiting, the cost of retention, the cost of attrition, those are all extraordinary. And we can't just be like, okay, we have to evolve with all of that. So we have to understand the biases that are baked into all of the workplace processes, from how we recruit, how we hire people, to how we onboard people, because those are, as I said, largely all built by white guys, right? And so that weird privilege is all baked in there. We have to look at all those programs and understand what the biases might show up looking at and eradicate And that's from just looking at all talent management processes. Excuse me. Sorry. I think it's taking a real hard look at and an informed look at all of those talent management processes that we just think may be free of bias because they're processes, but they're all built by people, they're enacted by people, and the structures and cultures in which they operate involve people. And so look at those, fine tooth comb them, remove as many biases as we possibly can from them, and then start anew. And then at the same time, concurrently, we have to look at pay with a real steadfast intentionality and be open about pay grades, be more transparent about those, stop requiring that people share last pay during the interview process because that's unfair. Because we know that there are differences with the way in which women negotiate and the way that men negotiate. And so we have to say, okay, there are biases there until we can change the whole world culturally. We have to acknowledge them for what they are and enable as much equity into this process as we possibly can so that people are treated fairly and equitably. And so those are very tactical things that we Catalyst can empower people to do. Again, we are very focused on the workplace, so that's where our expertise will come in. But people have expertise. We have a lot of partners, for example, that focus on child and adolescent and what kind of influences can we change there so that kids are raised with a better understanding of what's gendered and what's not and what's free to be and what's not. And we can be better watchdogs in that space about the kinds of marketing influences and such, reach our children and therefore teach our children, pink and blue. Fundamental is that. But so while Catalyst, that's not our space, and I wouldn't claim that expertise, there are lots of really fine, intelligent, exceptional folks doing work across that life cycle so that we can, at these really early stages, be right at the start and not just, sure that as fully cooked adults, we can simply change that because we can't. It's hard to be fully cooked and try to unbake oneself, right? And so I think Catalyst will remain as focused as we can on the workplace solutions. And I think we'll find and continue to find extraordinary partners to bring into the kind of discussions and events that we host, the kind of work that we do, try to be more inclusive of that as we go, understanding that, it's a whole self that we need to look at and not just the workplace, but we also know our lane. So we'll try to be uniquely positioned there and find others who are doing great work in other spaces.
Michael, I really appreciate what you said around, the within the company structure, leaders' responsibility for ensuring that there's equality and equity in the practices and processes and policies and procedures from day one.
Right.
I remember when that $4,600 number used to be $2,400. And even at that moment in time, that amounted to about $700,000 lost earnings from the moment in time a woman started her job to the time that she retired. Now I would imagine it'd be well over $1 million given the updated statistic. Thank you so much. This has been such an incredible hour spent with you. It's gone by so fast. Would love to have you back, as I'm sure that as we progress further into 2020 and think about how to re-envision 2021, there's going to be so many really unique, interesting, and innovative opportunities for continued dialogue in this space. Michael, how can our viewers stay in contact with you?
Well, I'm easy to find on the Catalyst website. Something that we ourselves are trying to work on is diversifying our own employee base. But so we're hiring more men with intention. We're looking at our metrics around race, ethnicity to try to diversify that. Even our boards, we're doing, I think, a better job of diversifying what our board of directors and our boards of advisors look like. So that's kind of the self-reflection piece that I was talking about, right? That leaning inward trait. So I would say www.catalyst.org is the best place to go and find all of this research. All of our research is publicly available, which is great. And I'm easy to find there, so people can find me. You can email me. I'm on social media. Yeah, I'm very flattered to have been invited today, and thank you. I hope what I shared opened up some minds and some, inquisitions and just inspired some folks. So we all have the capacity to make a difference. And so I hope this helped.
It's a beautiful way to end today's conversation. Thank you, Michael. Again, I'm Jan Mercer-Dahms, the Vice President of U.S. Development with Join Mayshad. Please check us out at joinmayshad.com. Subscribe to your YouTube channel, and we'll see you next week. Bye, everyone.